Luke, what's the most common thing you hear from people after you preach?
Well, after I preach, the most common thing people say is, that's right, nothing. People thought the recording went out there for a second, but no, that's just...
I thought you went out there for a second.
Yeah, that's the most common thing.
Okay.
People don't say much. They just go, cool.
Well, we won't be like that. We'll talk about it.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Preaching Through podcast. As always, this is the conversation that takes place when pastors come together to talk about what it is to lead, what it is to teach, what it is to preach about Jesus in 21st century America. Often the life of a pastor can feel a little bit isolated. Life of a pastor can feel a little bit lonely. There is a huge responsibility. Preaching is incredibly important, as are all of the areas of ministry, or most of the areas of ministry. There's probably some areas that we give a little bit more attention to than maybe deserve. But either which way, the call on your life is vital and important. And just discussing, hey, what does that look like for you? What does that look like for me? What does that look like for us in an ever-changing world is what we do here on this podcast. And I am Dave Shrine, here with my co-host, again, Luke Simmons. What's up, man?
Hey, Dave.
Doing good?
I'm doing great, man.
Did you have a good breakfast this morning?
I had a great breakfast. Yeah, you and I went to breakfast.
We did go to breakfast.
It was fun. We tried a new place. I don't know if it'll be our regular jam.
It might
Seemed
not
more
be.
like a lady place, but but it was good to be together.
I called my wife afterwards and I told her, she goes, I think you went to a girl breakfast place. I said, well, some men started streaming in like the last 20 minutes we were there, but it was mostly
if you're ever in Arizona and you need a recommendation for a breakfast place with a Bloody Mary bar, we got you covered.
We've got you covered. So this episode, we're going to be talking all about preaching through praise, criticism, and silence. Some of our past episodes have been more tactical, preaching through the ABCs, preaching through a wedding sermon or a memorial service or a funeral sermon, preaching through your notes, etc. But this is more continuing to preach with the aftermath of praise, criticism, and silence. And like, I would imagine this is a reality for you on a regular basis.
Oh man, it's a big deal. And this is part of the conversation we have in the last session of our preaching lab curriculum, talking about the dangers of preaching.
Yeah.
And one of the dangers is, how do you shepherd your heart through when you get a lot of positive attention and a lot of negative attention, or you get no attention, right? And you pour your heart into something, and what do you do with the feedback you do or don't get? It's a really important thing. And every pastor, really, in a sense, this is a weekly thing you have to navigate, because every week you're going to get some version of praise, criticism, or silence.
One of the things that I've talked multiple times just about my experience in the church, and I think one of the ways that I contributed to my own just pain in being hurt through ministry is this idea of forgetting that the pastor, the lead pastor, is a person, a real person, a sinful person, a person that it's really easy for me to put them on a pedestal and say, like, I think you said in either a past episode of this or the preaching lab curriculum, like we don't necessarily put ourselves up on that pedestal as the pastor, but a lot of times we don't do a whole lot to remove ourselves from that place.
Yeah, we don't love it, but we also don't probably do enough to stop it, right? Like it's like, that kind of feels nice up here, until it doesn't.
And that, I think, was one of the things where I was like, oh, the pastor, superhuman, I mean, it's cheesy to say, but like super Christian,
sure,
right? Doesn't get hurt, won't hurt other people. And it, like, none of that's true. Like, real person, real emotions, real feelings, real burden, same heart as everybody else, hopefully seeking out the Lord in ways that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily have time to do. But the truth is that praise, criticism, and silence are realities for me in my corporate America job. Like, sure. I'd actually almost prefer to have criticism than silence. And praise is great. I'm a words of affirmation guy, but I'd almost prefer to have criticism than just silence, because that silence is it's a killer, man. Like, you just you don't know where you stand, and it's really hard to gauge what you should do.
Well, then it seems like we need to talk about it.
We will talk about it. All right. Yeah, let's talk about it.
Your first 200 sermons are going to be terrible. This is something the late Tim Keller once said, meaning that no matter how hard you study, how many hours you put in, or how much you work on your preaching, there's this glass ceiling that can only be broken with more reps. So, getting reps becomes your main way of growing as a preacher. But what happens when you surpass 200 sermons? What are you supposed to work on? Where should you try and grow, or what muscles are you going to need to build to have a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry over the long haul? Well, the Preaching Lab is a curriculum developed by our co-host, Luke Simmons, that fills this gap and takes preachers beyond what they've learned in seminary or Bible college. This live experience provides preachers with meaningful feedback, insight, and instruction so that they can improve their preaching for a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry. During this 12-week preaching cohort, preachers learn of minor adjustments to their sermon habits that have a major impact on the preaching moment. Tweaks that nobody in your congregation has the ability or the confidence to give you. It's a deep inspection of your routines, habits, study, and preaching, all so that you can become a better steward of the gift God has given you every single week, an audience. This is your opportunity to return the favor back to your congregation and preach a sermon that is faithful and fruitful. Visit faithfulandfruitful.com/lab to learn more about the Preaching Lab live cohort, as well as the Preaching Lab on-demand video curriculum. Now back to the podcast.
We'll start with the praise and criticism. And you gave me, there may be more than this, but you gave me 3 areas of, hey, these are kind of what you need to be aware of. The first one is responding to the praise or responding to criticism. If you want to talk about them separately, we can, or if you want to just talk about them collectively, we can too.
Well, there's different ways that people give you praise or criticism, right? Sometimes it's verbal and face-to-face. Sometimes it's through a text message or email or other digital communication. So I think partly I'm thinking especially right now about the conversation that's face-to-face, right? Mm-hmm. So like someone comes up to you after the sermon and they go, "Oh, Pastor, that was so great. Thank you." Or, "Boy, you knocked it out of the park today." Or some sort of really encouraging thing. How do you handle that? There's this old story about Charles Spurgeon. I can't believe this is true, but maybe it is, where supposedly someone came up to him after a sermon and said, "Boy, that was such a great sermon." And he said, "I know, Satan already told me." And the story is told to preachers like this way of saying like, "Hey, don't let this praise go to your head," which is actually really good advice, right? Like, and we'll talk about that, but I can't imagine saying that to someone, "Hey, Pastor, you really knocked it out of the park." "I know, Satan already told me." Like that's a little harsh.
Don't ever speak to me again.
Yeah, seriously. How to no longer get praise from people. So I mean, what I'm most likely to do is just go, "Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that." Praise God. I think sometimes we can be a little too, it's like the hitter that hits a home run and then you got to point to the sky a bunch, go, "It wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was him. It was me." Like, okay, like, yeah, give God glory. But I just think it's not wrong to just say, "Hey, thanks. I really appreciate that." A lot of times it's that, and I also feel like the more specific the praise, the more specific the response I might have to it would be, right? If someone goes, "Hey man, that was a really great sermon," then all I need to say is, "Hey, I really appreciate that." If they say to me, "Man, that thing you were saying about on that second point, like, man, that really, really just spoke to me," at that point I want to go, "Oh, tell me more about that. Like, what was it that connected?" And so I think to be able to have those conversations and not be insecure and not be weird, I think that's really significant. And then I probably handle it the same way if it's digital praise or communication that way. It's just, the more specific it is, the more interested I am actually in it, because partly because if someone's giving me specific feedback, part of what I want to know is, oh, why did that connect? Why did that work? And a lot of times it's just what's going on in their life. Occasionally it actually has something to do with how I delivered it or how I thought it through or whatever. And I want to try to repeat that. Like, I was a college baseball player, and a lot of times people would watch film when they were doing poorly, but it only helped to watch film when you were doing poorly if you had film of when you were doing really well, because then you had something to compare it to. And I always wanted to actually watch the at-bats where I was really dialed in, because that showed me, oh, that's what I want to keep repeating. And so if people are giving really specific praise, then man, I want to know more. Not more like, "Hey, tell me more about how great I am,"
right?
But more like, tell me what clicked, tell me what connected. So that's how I think about it with that. And then it's probably a little bit different on the criticism side. Most criticism is not going to come to your face. Most of it these days is going to come through email. But when it does come to your face, I think what I mostly want to do is really the same thing, is to go, well, I appreciate that. That's something I'll think about. A lot of times the criticism for me that's face-to-face comes in the form of someone coming up to me and telling me what I should have also included in my sermon, something like that. And I'll just go, oh, great. Yeah, thanks. I'll think about that. I just think like that sort of criticism, similarly to the praise, like it's not that deep of praise. It's not that deep of criticism. So I don't take it that deeply. I just go, oh, appreciate it.
A good coach is going to help you anticipate, here's what you're going to encounter. Now, for a pastor who's been preaching any number of weeks, they know that praise and criticism will eventually come or has already come. But preparing a response ahead of time, knowing what you're going to say, I think that's often why we get into awkward situations, is because we haven't anticipated what's coming our way. I think now about being a dad and my kids going through things that I didn't have the words to vocalize, or I didn't have the words to articulate how I felt, being able to sit down now and talk with them and say, well, here's, how do you feel about this? And then I'll share some wording with them. And all of a sudden it like makes more sense to them. So I love the idea of being prepared for whatever comes your way. And I think a good coach can help you prep for that. Let me ask you this. Do you feel like it often reflects more of like who they are and what they're going through and something about them, as opposed to necessarily something you did or didn't do? Like that's how I feel when I get criticism. Often it's like, it's a reflection of what's going on in their life.
Yeah, I think that's often true. I mean, people do really, and I don't mean this as critically as it's going to sound, but people mostly just think about themselves. People love to talk about themselves. And so even their praise or their criticism is often, very in line with just how they're feeling about themselves at that time. I don't think that means we should dismiss it, right? Because we love these people and we care about them and we care about what's going on. But yeah, it often is that sort of a thing. I think that a lot of times what people are going to go out of their way to critique says a lot about them as well as about whatever they're critiquing. But other criticism, again, where it's specific and it's helpful. I remember some years ago, I was, I don't remember exactly what I was talking about, but I made a joke or something about food allergies, and I had this woman who's a mom in the church, send me a very long email about how hard her life is as a mom with kids with really severe food allergies. And I went, oh man, like on one hand, I wanted to dismiss like, lady, I was kidding. Like it was just a joke. Like on the other hand, it was like, hey, that was hurtful to her because she has to live face to face all the time with that sort of a thing. And I had no idea really that it was that significant or that severe. And so to be able to go, you know what, I'm going to actually think about that. And so that's some of it on the criticism is to go, I just want to have a mentality that says if 99% of what they say is their problem or a disproportionate reaction or whatever, okay, whatever. But I'm going to try to take that 1% and see if I can learn from it.
What are the different layers maybe that you can think of over the past where it's like, here's how I let things go a little bit deeper. Here's how I resonate. And do you have a filter or a rubric? We've talked about the ABCs of preaching. Does that play a factor just to give me a starting point for evaluating beyond just the, oh, okay, thanks. I'll think about that.
Sure. On the criticism, it's interesting because a lot of times that will come in, and it's not just criticism about the preaching, right? It's also criticism about the church or about the service, right? The volume of the music or the temperature of the room or the, whatever. And as, typically a lot of the guys listening to this who are preaching regularly are also the lead pastor or the senior pastor. Like you're going to hear that. And I know sometimes preachers will debate about, if there's unsigned comments, right? We have like a prayer card and it's not really meant to be like a comment card, but people use it that way sometimes. I've told our team, hey, anytime anybody writes anything on there that's a comment, I want you to share it with me, good or bad, whether they sign it or whether they don't. That's unusual. I think most pastors actually say, hey, if someone doesn't have the courage to sign it, I don't want to hear what it is. I feel like if someone doesn't have the courage to sign it, I'm going to take it less seriously, but I still want to know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think like, if someone's going to write it down, they're probably not the only person that thinks that. And at the same time, I want to have it be in proportion to their level of courage
right.
to put their name on it. If it's an email, well, that's again, a little bit of a different thing. One just pro tip here. I just can't recommend this enough. I was in a church at one point and the pastor would frequently say something, he goes like, hey, I know this is going to upset you. So, don't send me a bunch of emails this week, blah, 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 blah. And he would regularly comment on how, I got a bunch of emails last week, blah, blah, blah. What it did is it told people that was the appropriate way to critique him. What do you know? He kept getting more emails, right? Like it was an invitation, actually. Please send me your upset email.
This is how you get my attention.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just, at that point, was like, I'm going to make a decision. I'm never going to do that. You've been in the church for a number of years, Dave. I don't think you've ever heard me do that. Like, I don't ever comment about that. And as a result, I get very few critical emails. People often will go, man, you must get a lot of critical emails. I get hardly any because I don't invite them. If you invite them, you'll get them. If you mention them, it gets people's attention. Mm-hmm. And so therefore for me, because I'm not getting a bunch of like just gripey stuff all the time, then when I do get a truly like critical email, it's like, it actually is more meaningful to me and more helpful to me because I realize like this must have actually come from a place of concern rather than just, this is like the comments section on Facebook. People are just venting,
Yuck. Do you distinct between critique and criticism? Do you distinguish between those two?
Yeah. Dave, I don't know if I've ever thought of it that way, but that's probably right? Like there's a sense in which a critique probably has with it, at least in my mind, when I hear those two words, a kind of a coaching element, right? Like part of what I do in the Preaching Lab Live is I, evaluate sermons and I offer some critique, right? But that's all constructive. Mm-hmm. Whereas maybe criticism feels more just like I'm just trying to be upset about something. Either way, I think like you really can learn a lot from critical feedback, from negative things. The goal is to get better and the goal is to serve people.
Yeah.
And, we're humble, hopefully. At least we're supposed to be. We're followers of the Lord. He received plenty of criticism. No one benefits if all criticism is just, well, they don't like me and I dismiss it. So you got to take it the way it's intended and learn from it.
Growing up in athletics, praise and criticism often comes. I would imagine coaches are your biggest critics and maybe friends and family members could be your biggest advocates and praise people. That's just what it was for me. I was not competitive or anything like that, but coaches were often the more critical. Did that prepare you for being able to handle criticism? Does it not really even play a part? And maybe even are there things outside of that have helped you prepare to receive criticism and helped you balance your attitude so you can receive it as opposed to just disregard it altogether?
Yeah, it probably did prepare me. Like one of my college coaches, he would say, listen, if I'm never on your case, this is how he talked. If I'm never on your case, that means one of two things. Either you're the perfect player or I don't think you can get any better. And I've never coached a perfect player. So, and there were guys, and you actually would see in the program, there were guys he didn't say anything to. And that was not a good sign. That was a sign of like, I don't think you can get any better. And so I do think I internalize that to say, if I'm getting critique, if I'm getting coached, if I'm getting, hey, why don't you think about this? That actually means someone sees potential in me to improve. And there is an opportunity to grow. So yeah, I do embrace that for that reason. I think I've been surprised in the non-athletic world, which is most of the world, how like upsetting and troubling critique is, right? And so we've tried to build a culture where critique is normal. And I just think of in the Proverbs where it says, wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses, right? If someone is just, we have words for that, right?
We do have words.
That's not a friend. That's actually someone that's just, they're not really there to help you. And yet wounds from a friend can be trusted, right? Wounds from an enemy, I don't know. Wounds from the person who's always unhappy, wounds from the person who really, they're just mad at themselves and they're going to blame it on their church, which actually a lot of criticism of the church is that. I found that a lot of times it's people are unhappy with their walk. They're unhappy with their life. They're unhappy with their marriage. They're unhappy with their lack of discipline. They're going to take it out on the church leadership. But wounds from a friend, right? So when I get that email from that woman whose kids have the food things, like I've only experienced her as like a faithful person in the church, a supportive person in the church. She's not trying to hurt me. She's not trying to zing me. She's not like, why would I not learn from this? So I think there is that kind of, there's the criticism. The kind of criticism though that I think most pastors don't get. A lot of pastors get criticism over, here's the thing you said, or here's the thing you didn't say. A lot of times people don't get a lot of criticism or critique over like how they're doing. Or if they do, it's pretty bland, right? An elder will say, hey, these sermons are going long.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't help a guy very much. Or, this is kind of boring. Well, that might be really true, but like, how does a guy fix it, right? So that's some of the work you and I are trying to do, is to help pastors figure out like, well, what do you do if it's consistently too long? How do you actually fix that through your sermon prep process? Or, hey, this is, gets kind of boring. Well, what do you actually, like, there's things you actually can do. And so that's the thing, is I also think critique, it's criticism with a suggestion. You did this, but you could do that. And so that's why I really value critique. Just blanket criticism is not my favorite, but it's part of the deal.
Do you have people in your life who you will go to evaluate maybe some criticism that you've received? And what does that evaluation process look like for you?
That's a great question. So there are people who every Sunday, I preach 3 services, and after the first one, there are people I'll go to every week after the first service and say, what do you got for me? And that is basically saying, please critique me. And at that point they'll offer some suggestions, right? And when I say, what do you got for me? I'm really not hoping that they say, nothing. Like, I actually want it to get better. So I know that I'm inviting that kind of feedback. Then I also know on our team, because we've developed some culture where it's normal and invited to share concerns. And if there's things that I'm doing that people are kind of noticing, hey, I don't know if that would have come across the right way, they're going to tell me. I think cultivating an environment where that's normal is good. But then, when I get criticism about something, and especially if I'm like, I don't know, this doesn't feel totally fair, or, that's not really what I was trying to do, I'll oftentimes go to other leaders and, say, hey, here's this thing that this person said. What do you think? If I share the critique with my wife, I'll make sure to never say who said it.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question, is like, how often will you do that? Because I know that my wife gets very protective of me, and it really impacts the way she feels beyond that comment.
Mostly I want my wife, Molly, to be able to just enjoy the church on her own. Like, she can decide whether or not to like people.
That's what she wants. That's what she said.
And I don't want to decide it for her.
Yeah.
Right. And if I tell her, hey, so-and-so told me blah, 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 like, she's going to probably just pre-decide to dislike that.
Yeah.
So, on the other hand, if it's like, hey, I got this feedback and it really hurt, well, I feel like my wife should probably know that, but she doesn't need to know where it came from. If it's like, hey, I got this critique and I think they were really right, I think that's valuable for her to hear, like, that she has a husband who's willing to learn from criticism. Like, that's great. And then if it's like, I don't know about this, she can help me discern it and go, you know what, I think there's something to that. But again, I try to keep the names out of it so that she doesn't permanently, a lot of times, Dave, you and I as guys, like, you get in a fight with your buddy and, you make up not very long after that. Right. And, but if you tell your wife about the fight, but you forget to tell her about the makeup, we're cool again, and that she's going to just hate that person forever on your behalf, not realizing I don't want you to, so I want to avoid that. And then the other thing I think about with criticism is that there really is a difference between the intent of your words and the impact of your words. And this gets frustrating as preachers, because a lot of times people will say, well, when you said this, it made me feel this way. And you're going, but I didn't mean that. Like, that wasn't my intent. And what we have to realize in today's culture, every episode you begin with talking about what is it to faithful preaching in 21st century America. Well, 21st century America is a listener-focused communication paradigm. What you say and how it impacts people really is, in their mind, what it meant. So sometimes we have to just get over that and accept the fact that, okay, I didn't mean it that way, but this is how they heard it. And therefore, I can still learn from that. Now, sometimes you'll hear it and you go, you know what? I would have said it that way again. If I had it to do over again, I'd do it that way again. But sometimes you also might say, you know what? Here's actually a different way where what I'm intending could feel to people like what I'm intending, versus they end up feeling something I didn't intend. So if what you're trying to do is be understood, then sometimes you have to think, well, what could be misunderstood and how can I say it differently?
So the praise part and the criticism part, it's easy to talk about those, but the majority of the feedback, I would imagine and in my leadership, it's silence. It's neither praise nor criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's anxiety inducing for me in my leadership, because it's like, give me an idea of how I'm doing here. Give me an idea of, I'd rather you criticize me. So silence in your role, I would imagine it's there.
Oh, it's really there. Yeah. And probably the place where it's hardest for me, since I've already talked about her, is my wife, Molly. I think we've talked about in a previous episode, she doesn't want me to run the sermon by her before she's just in the service. She's usually at our second service, and she's there, and she wants to experience that fresh, just like anybody else. And actually, it was really cool. Recently, she was telling me about how something I preached in connection with the song, that we did, like, really impacted her and expanded her trust of the Lord in some ways. And I actually shared that with one of our worship leaders, and he said, man, it's so cool that after all these years, Molly can just be ministered to through our services. Like, she's seen how all the sausage gets made, and she still can be blessed by it. So anyway, but a lot of times it's Sunday afternoon, and it's like, I've poured my heart out, and we're having lunch, and it's like, all right, what are we on? What are we doing this week? And I'm sitting there kind of going like, does anybody have anything to say about the thing I just spent 40 minutes talking about? Like, and so I can get a little insecure in those moments. And so, we've learned a little shorthand over the years where I'll go, hey, how was today? Mostly it's exactly what you're saying, Dave. It's like the silence is worse than if she was like, yeah, it was pretty good. Like, that doesn't mean very much, but the not knowing, I mean, isn't that what's so hard about it?
It's incredibly difficult. Where do we stand?
Yeah.
It seems to me, it's just the exact same of like when we're personally interacting, and I can just tell that she's silent and she's working through some stuff.
Yeah.
And I want so badly to know, does this have anything to do with me?
Right.
And like, just at least tell me that it doesn't have anything to do, or if it does, I want to know. We don't have to talk about it, but I just want to know.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference. And,
well, there's a few things that have helped me over the years with the silence. So beyond Molly, just the reality of a lot of preachers is it's mostly silence, right? Your elders don't say much most weeks. Your staff doesn't say much most weeks. Most people don't say much most weeks, right? You get a few of the, hey, that was great. Every now and then you get the critical email, but it's mostly like, whatever, radio silence. And I think at that point, there's a few things that have helped me. One is, years ago, I played baseball on an Athletes in Action team. Athletes in Action was the sports ministry of Crew, and they had these different principles on how to apply your faith to your sport. And one of the principles was you play for an audience of one. You play for an audience of one. And I'm so thankful that that's in my heart, because on one hand, I am trying to serve these people. I'm trying to minister to these people. I'm trying to create life change for these people. But in the end, I serve for an audience of one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm preaching for an audience of one. And what I think he cares most about is, did I trust him in the process? Did I include him in the process? Was I prayerful? Was I studious? Right, there's that place, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Timothy, where it talks about being a faithful worker who cuts the word and handles it correctly. Like, did I do the work? Did I prepare? Did I give my best effort? And I feel like that's the stuff the Lord cares about, right? And so playing for an audience of one really, I know it sounds corny and it sounds cheesy, but it's like, that is what you're doing. And that might even be more important when you get the praise and when you get the criticism, is to say, well, even then, it's not like, well, I'm only playing for an audience of one when no one says anything. It's like, no, I'm playing for an audience of one all the time. But especially when people aren't saying anything, that helps. Another thing is to just know what you're aiming at, right? What is your goal? What are you about? And we talked about this with the conversation about ABCs, the assumptions, beliefs, convictions about preaching. Part of what that does is it says, okay, at my core, here's what I'm doing in my preaching. Well, that gives me at least a standard to evaluate against, versus just, well, I just put it out there and who knows? Like other people may not say much, but I know how I think it went. And that's a lot of what your ABCs are, is that like, hey, how did it go? Well, whatever it is you're evaluating against, those are your true ABCs. Those are the things you actually care. And then the third piece for me that helps me a lot is really to think, how close was I to having what came out of my mouth be what I hoped would come out of my mouth? And I feel like if those things are pretty close, then I'm pretty happy. regardless of what people said. Now, sometimes what came out of my mouth was way better than I expected. And something happened in the moment and the Lord gave some fresh insight, or I felt something land in the room and I spent a little more time on it than I had intended, or like that's where you just really praise the Lord for. What's tough is when it's like, oh man, I knew what I wanted to say and I know what I wanted to come out, but just like it couldn't quite, right? It's like that time when you just have something on the tip of your brain and you're like, I can't quite, like that's really frustrating. And in those cases you go, well, Lord, help me have that be different next time. But that's a lot of what I'm thinking about. If I had a good plan and I executed the plan to the best of my ability, and I included and trusted the Lord through the process, then I'm just going to leave the results in his hands and I'm going to trust him. And whether people say a lot or say nothing, I'm going to be able to sleep at night, put my notes in the trash, and move on my way.
As a business owner and as a leader in that business, the amount of praise that I get is very, very little.
Sure.
But I thrive off of praise. Like I love positive affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with one of our clients this week, and there was a video that went out to everybody that had anything to do with the marketing team. And it was meant to be a motivational video, but it was really demotivating for me because it was saying, we got to pick this up and we have to do this better and we have to do this better and we have to work harder. And I'm sitting back thinking, like, you said in a previous episode, phoning it in, that's not really something I'm wired to do. I actually think I'm wired the opposite way. That's the way it is for me too. I don't phone it in.
Yeah.
I'm wired to actually go the opposite way, overdo what I'm supposed to do. Like you were asking me, hey, I was thinking about doing this. Do you think it would be a good investment of time? I was like, yeah, but I think if you hit a C, if you didn't aim for a B or an A, if you did it as a C, I think it'd be a good investment of time. You're like, that's the antithesis of who I am.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that's the antithesis of who I am.
Yeah.
And that feedback loop was really demotivating to me, but just hey, I saw the email that you wrote. That looked really good. Let's have more of that. That just like challenges me and fires me up. And I want that feedback from my team too. Like I want praise from my team, but it's a very insecure leader that's always trying to solicit praise. One of the things that I found, and maybe Coach Luke, you can correct me on this or give me some additional critique or insight, but one of the things that I found is whenever that sort of thing comes my way from people who I value it from, especially, to just say, hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate you saying something. I know you could have not said it, but it really helps me a lot to hear that. So affirming in the person what really means a lot to me, as opposed to saying, hey, I would love to get, whatever praise you guys have, to send that my way. You might mean it in the best way possible, but for somebody like me who actually thrives on praise and thrives on positive affirmation, it is an audience of one. I know who I am in Christ. I know what God's called me to do right here, right now. Ultimately, that needs to be where my satisfaction is found. But it is really nice to hear a positive affirmation.
Well, a lot of people listening right now are thinking of Michael in the office saying, I don't need to be loved, not like I need to be praised. Yeah, Dave, I mean, you're really hitting on something, is like people need varying levels of affirmation and praise from others, right? You've mentioned that you're kind of a words of affirmation, love language person.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I tend to be a little bit that way as well. At the same time, I've gotten so much praise over the years, and I realize how stupid that sounds, but like I've been preaching for 15 years.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people say really nice things to me about my preaching, right? That's what I mean.
Yeah.
And most of them I don't know that well. I don't know how well, where it's all coming, right? So that doesn't mean as much to me as like when you have really encouraging things to say, or when Molly does, or when some of my other closer friends have like actual specific heartfelt things to say. Like that means more. So I think we all do have a sense of like, this is the praise and the critique that means more to us. And I think one idea that I had just as you were talking, Dave, is, for people who are going, I'm not getting much feedback, is I think there's a way to invite it that isn't insecure, right? The insecure way to do it is spur of the moment to walk up to someone and go, hey, what did you think about the thing? Well, what are they going to say?
Right.
Did you like it? Did you like it? Did you like? That's a black hole of insecurity that you can't fill in someone else if that's really how they feel. But what you could do is say, hey, you know what? I don't get a lot of feedback on the stuff that I do really well or the stuff that I don't. And I'd love to give you the opportunity to give me some of that feedback because your view really matters a lot to me. Do you think that we could meet in the next couple weeks. And you could, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think are the things that I'm doing really well? And one of the things that, if you had a magic wand, you'd help me change.
Mm-hmm.
That gives the person time to think about it. It's not coming out of insecurity as much as it's coming out of, hey, really, please be my coach, be a helpful critic here. And I think most people would welcome that, and they'd love to do that. And because they will have had actually time to be thoughtful about it, and they aren't just trying to feed a black hole of insecurity, their comments will mean more. They'll be more thoughtful, and you can actually get the feedback you need. So I do think we do need feedback. Some of us need, more than others. One of my favorite podcasts is Smartless.
Mm-hmm.
I've recommended a few episodes. Will Arnett, they talk about Will, and they say, no one wakes up in the morning more happy to be himself than Will Arnett. And when I heard that, I was like, I think I actually feel like that.
Yeah.
I'm a very confident person. Yeah. And yet, even that way, there are people who, man, their praise means a lot. Their critique, I got to take it to heart. And we got to figure out a way to get some of it.
The praise, the criticism, silence, it's all coming your way, especially when you combined ministry work done in a public setting with content creation. You are putting not just your heart, not just your mind, not just your creative energy towards something, but there's also an emotional and a spiritual element, and all sorts of things are wrapped up in that, not the least of which is just the spiritual attack that's going to be coming. So being aware of, number one, what's coming your way, being aware, number two, of how you're going to respond to it or how you're going to handle it, and being aware of, number three, how you're going to move forward and get better from it. All three of those things are going to be vital as you seek to elevate your job as a preacher. One of the comments that came in on an Instagram video that we put up, we post clips from the podcast up there, was just talked about finding your voice. And I just want someone to preach the word. Well, the truth is yes, you want to preach the word, but everybody's different.
Sure.
Everybody's wired differently. And yes, preach the word, but there's an element of discovering who you are, discovering how God has wired you, the context in which he's called you to preach. And then on top of all of that, filtering as yourself all of that stuff in a way that's helpful. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. If you enjoyed it, or if you have any criticism, you can send it to us, info@faithfulandfruitful.com. We would love to hear from you. If you've got ideas on a future episode, you'd say, hey, I'd really like to hear what you have to say about preaching through, whatever the case might be. Info@faithfulandfruitful.com is the best place to go. If you listen on Apple or Spotify, please leave a review. We'd really appreciate that. That would help us to know where we are hitting the mark and where we can continue to hit the mark or elevate. But by and large, I just encourage you to go back, listen to old episodes. They're not old in the sense of expired. They're timeless content, but they could really help you through whatever seasons of ministry you're navigating. So go back through season 1, beginning of season 2. In an upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking about preaching the sermon series after Easter. We're going to talk about preaching through the summer, and we'll talk about, I think we're going to do the episode of preaching through your first year at a church, your first year at a new job maybe. So that'll be a lot of fun. All right. Take care.